Hello everyone, Attack Power here with a fresh tutorial on how not to suck with your tanks in Steel Division 2. Let's dive right in here to the glorious tank tab. Now, for those of you who don't know, tanks are your armored fist, oftentimes your offensive power, or perhaps your really hard defensive power that can stop the opponent in their tracks. Usually a tank comes with some sort of main gun and supporting weaponry, which is usually a machine gun. They are armored, front, side, tops, and back, and come along with a whole bunch of other stats. So let's go over the stats first here and get a couple things out of the way. First off, most tanks have two different types of armament for their main gun, and that is an HE, which is high explosive, used against soft targets such as infantry, support guns, anything that doesn't have armor. And then they have AP rounds, armor piercing types of rounds, and these are used for armored targets, things that they need to pierce through. Tanks can also have other kinds of ammunition such as APCR and heat, which are essentially just special ammunitions used for armored targets as well. The only thing shot at infantry is HE. Tanks can come with other kinds of weaponry used for armor piercing, and if you don't understand the different ammunition, make sure to go check out my tutorial on that so you can learn about those different ammunition types. But let's jump over here really quick and check out our stats. So we have a whole bunch of stats here. There's only a couple that are really important. A lot of them you can actually kind of ignore because it's just not significantly relevant. One thing you don't need to be worried about is your machine gun stats. They're there. Just know whether a tank has one or two machine guns. That's helpful, or none. That's helpful to know so you know how fast you'll be able to pin down infantry and stuff. But other than that, you don't need to memorize the statistics of the machine gun other than knowing it fires 750 meter range. That's really the only stat there you really need to know. The gun, though, is the main one we're thinking about here. And if we look, penetration is how much armor value the tank can penetrate. So if the opponent has a tank with 100 millimeters of armor, you generally would need a tank with 100 millimeters of penetration or more to pen that tank. Now, this is extremely important that you understand. In this game, this number right here, this 250 we're seeing right now, is at point blank range. In other words, it's if the tank was in 100 meters of another tank, it would penetrate 250 millimeters of armor. As you move away from your target, your penetration drops off. So if I'm shooting at a tank that is 1,000 meters away, this penetration is probably something closer to 230 or 240, something of that nature. Okay, there's no like exact, I don't have the exact numbers. I know someone made a Google sheet at some point showing the exact drop off, but every gun is different, of course, because, it starts at a different number. But there is a drop-off curve to that penetration. So do understand, if you are firing at a tank or firing at a target that is at maximum range of the gun, the penetration value is going to be technically much lower, and your chances of penetrating the tank will be much lower. So you're going to think, why is this bouncing? It has 100 millimeters of armor and my gun penetrates 100 millimeters of armor. Yeah, when it's right next to it. But if it's at maximum range, it actually really struggles to penetrate that armor. So it's important to understand that when you're making tank engagements. This is why a lot of new players lose their tank battles. Next is damage. And now damage is not super important to remember, but it is a factor. One thing we do not see here is that tanks secretly have health. Tanks have health. It doesn't say anywhere here. There's no numerical value that you can find. But essentially, light tanks have either 6 or 8 health. I don't even remember. It's either 6 or 8 health. Light tanks have 6 or 8 health, which means medium tanks will kill them in one shot because medium tanks generally do 8 damage. Medium tanks have 10 health, which means that another medium tank or light tank, or just any gun that deals 8 damage, which is many of them, will take at least 2 penetrations to kill that tank. Okay, this is extremely important and a fundamental core part of tank battles in Steel Division 2 is that, generally speaking, most tanks require 2 penetrations to kill. Not a bounce, an actual penetration. Okay? Heavy tanks actually have 12 health. So for a medium tank, it doesn't matter. They do 8 damage plus 8 damage, 16. They'll still kill a heavy tank in 2 pens. But there are a number of AT guns and handheld things that do less than 8. Maybe they do 4 or 3. Which that 12 damage then will add another shot of penetration required to kill that tank. So just know there is no health bar to see. There's no way to know. It just is. Medium tanks are 10, light tanks are 6 or 8, and heavy tanks are 12. Okay, so just keep this in mind in your tank battles and something just to remember for yourself. Also, there's no way to heal your tanks in Steel Division 2. Once they're damaged, they're damaged. That's it. No supply trucks will save them. No, nothing will get them back to health. They are damaged. So if a tank tanks a penetration in an earlier engagement and then engages a new target, it's only going to require 1 penetration to kill that tank. So it's just something to keep in mind when battling with your tanks. Suppression, it's not really something to worry about. It's how much suppression it causes when it fires. That's fine. Nobody cares. It suppresses stuff. Blast, same thing. It's how much damage, like how much suppression damage and damage it'll do in a circle radius around its landing spot. But these two stats are completely unimportant to remember. Accuracy, nice to know, but once again, it's not like the most important stat. It obviously matters. The higher the accuracy, the more consistently a tank will hit their shots. But each time a tank fires, the accuracy goes up. So, you know, you start at 40%, or let's say in this case, 40% is pretty standard for a lot of tanks. You start at 40%, your second shot is 64%, and your third shot is like 92%. So, you know, each shot increases the accuracy chance of your gun. So yeah, starting off higher obviously is better, but you don't need to necessarily know this tank has 40% accuracy. Generally speaking, most players just know, oh, this tank is generally inaccurate, or this tank is standard. You know, there's really not a lot of gray area there. Range, this is another really important stat to know. So penetration and range are probably the two most important stats to have memorized here. Range is how far the gun shoots, okay? The maximum range in the game is 2,000 meters for direct fire weapons, so like a tank gun. But there's a whole variety of ranges in the game. 1750 is very common for many Axis medium tanks. 2,000 meters is very common for heavy tanks. 1,500 meters is pretty common for Allied medium tanks, Shermans and T-34s. Panzer IVs and Stug 3s fire at 1750. Yes, there's a difference that's important to understand. Axis armor often fires farther and has higher penetration values than Allied armor. But attack power, why? Doesn't that mean Axis armor is all better? Well, yes and no. A lot of times Axis armor is a little bit worse at fighting infantry. Also, it's a lot of times slower, or it's slower to turn, things like this, where Allied armor tends to be a little bit more nimble. It also is often a little bit cheaper, so you get made up for in the cost. Finally, we have rate of fire, okay? And this is obviously how fast the gun shoots. And again, this is not an exact actual number. It doesn't actually only fire 6 rounds a minute, or 7 or 8 or whatever. It's not an exact number. It's just a general idea of how the gun fires, okay? So the higher the rate of fire, the faster it's going to shoot. It's pretty straightforward. Then we have armored stats. Okay, so front armor is obviously the armor on the front of the vehicle and only applies there. Side armor is the side armor. Okay, it's generally far lower than the front armor. And back armor is even lower than that. Top armor, you can kind of ignore, I'll be honest with you. If the tank has if the tank is closed in, so it's not an open top vehicle, it's got good top armor and it's fine. It is what it is. That's not important to memorize. Really, it's the front armor you need to know. Generally speaking, the tank is always going to automatically face whatever's shooting at it. So, you know, generally speaking, the armor you're dealing with is the front armor. If you can get side and back shots, that's phenomenal. That helps you kill the opponent's tank. It can allow you to kill tanks that are much bigger than yours. So you have to keep that in mind. A lot of times you can distract a tank with one unit and then shoot it from the side with another. It's a very common tactic, and that's a way to kill tanks that are much stronger than your tanks and perhaps you couldn't penetrate otherwise. Next, we have our miscellaneous stats. Here we have speed and road speed. Road speed is, of course, when your tank is on a road, and speed is when it's not. Stealth is how stealthy tanks are. Most tanks are low stealth. The Panther here happens to be medium stealth, which is nice, which means when it sits in yellow cover, there's a chance that things actually won't be able to see it. Remember, your tanks cannot go into green cover. Armor vehicles of any sort cannot go into the green forest. So really, when we're talking about stealth, we're really just talking about yellow forests for that. And optics for tanks are basically always very low. This is important to understand. This means that the tanks will not be able to see most targets without the help of another unit. Generally speaking, infantry or some kind of recon unit. Okay, so this is so important to understand. Your tank, if you just drive one tank all by itself into the enemy territory, is probably not going to see anything. It's not going to see any targets. It might see a tank once that tank shoots at it. But other than that, it's not going to see stuff. So make sure your tanks are accompanied by something that can see things. Okay, this is very, very important. All right, so we got a lot of the important stats out of the way here. There are a couple other stats I want you to understand. We talked about health. Every tank has a health bar. Okay, you can't see it. There's no way to know. You can zoom in on the tank to see how much damage it's taken, and that'll give you kind of a rough estimate. So if you're not sure if a tank's been penetrated, you can zoom in. The tank will look beat up. That means it's been penetrated or it's taken some amount of damage, and that means you probably can kill it much faster. So we have our health. Another secret stat is the turret speed. So how fast a turret turns is extremely important because it allows the tank to get on target faster. This is not a stat you can know, unfortunately. It's just learning as you go that certain tanks turn really slow and have really slow turret speeds. The Sherman has a very fast turning speed. The Panther G, the Panzer G has a very slow turning speed, or maybe it's the Panzer J. Okay, whatever. It's got a slow turret speed. So it's just another one of those stats, unfortunately, we can't see. You just have to know. Finally, another secret stat is stabilizers, which only really applies to the Sherman. The Sherman has this special thing that allows it to aim faster when it fires its shot, its first shot originally. So it's just one of those things the Sherman gets that's kind of like a bonus. So let's compare some very common tanks so we can see the differences in things that you just really need to understand and know when you're playing the game. Very common tank, Panzer IV for the Axis. We see these in a ton of divisions. You can see down here how many divisions it is present in. So there's a lot of options here. We zoom in here, we see 135 millimeters of penetration, 1750 meter range, 75 millimeters of frontal armor. And again, these are the important stats that you need to know. Okay, these are like the most important. Knowing other things is nice. The Panzer IV is kind of slow at 39 kilometers an hour. It fires relatively fast at 7 rounds a minute. Its accuracy is standard at 40%, and it does standard damage of 8 damage. Okay, but again, the important ones, 135, 1750, and 75 front. So we can see that this is kind of thin, because let's compare it to something like the T-34 or the Sherman, because we ran into that first. So which Sherman do we want here? Sure, the Sherman 3. So if we look at the Sherman here, it only has 90 millimeters of penetration. Okay, it only has 1500 millimeters of range, but it has 100 millimeters of front armor, and it goes a fair bit faster at 48 kilometers an hour. Again, not important stat to know, but it's nice to know. Rounds per minute is the same. Accuracy in the Shermans is actually higher as well. So when these two guys match up, right, the Panzer IV should be able to pen the Sherman pretty easily all the time because it's 135 millimeters of penetration on 100 millimeters of armor, excuse me. On the flip side, the Sherman should be able to pen the Panzer IV pretty consistently at 90 millimeters of penetration versus 75 millimeters of armor. But remember, the Panzer IV gets 250 meters more range to fire first, right? But it turns slower, has a slower turret speed, and a slower aiming speed. So again, it's just this kind of balancing act of the different armor that determines who's going to win that engagement. That's where your micro comes into play and things like that. All right, so these are just stats to know. Most of the medium tanks in the game can kill each other. Okay, it's a pretty general, theme across the board. Here's the T-34, 100 millimeters of penetration, 1500 meters of range, 90 millimeters of armor. So we can see very similar to the Sherman, a little bit different with a higher gun penetration and a slightly lower armor. Same 1500 meter range. Like I said, Allied tanks generally sit around this 1500 meter range, at least they're medium tanks. But all 3 of these tanks can kill each other. Okay, it's a nice little circle that goes around. All 3 of these units can kill each other just fine. All right, this is kind of part of the whole thing. Okay, now our next step here with the tanks, normal medium tanks are not great infantry killers. Right, your standard T-34, Panzer IV, they are not incredible infantry killers with their HE round here. You can see it only does 1.52 damage. Really, that means when it lands a hit, it'll kill 1 guy, sometimes 2. All right, and that's not happening very quickly with that low rate of fire. All right, it's really up to the machine guns of the tank to pin down the infantry to help other units mop it up. Okay, you're not going to wipe out infantry using tanks generally. Certain tanks have a pretty strong loadout. T-28, for example, has 3 DT machine guns. So it's going to put out a little bit more damage, right? The Sherman, the one we were just talking about. The Sherman has 3 machine... Oh, no, it usually has 3. Am I looking at the wrong Sherman? Yeah, there we go. 3 machine guns, right? And one of them is a 50 cal. So this thing's going to carve through infantry pretty quickly. But on the whole, most tanks are going to struggle to actually kill infantry quickly. So do not expect tanks to just run over infantry really easy. It doesn't work that way. They fight back. Your tanks will die, and they just won't do all that much. So be very careful with your tanks. They need to be supported. This is where a lot of new players lose a lot of points because they just throw tanks at problems, and they're like, this will solve everything. No, it won't. It will not solve everything. Tanks are part of a combined arms. You use them in conjunction with other units, and then they can truly shine. They can help punch through certain situations. They can also hold up your opponent. If you have a high armor tank, such as, let's say, the Tiger or something, and your opponent doesn't have a lot of things that can penetrate the Tiger, okay, then it can really hold up your opponent and they can have a really hard time of getting through that brick wall of your unit. So that's a good usage of him. Other than that, remember, bigger tanks such as the Tiger or the Panther or the IS-2 or the King Tiger or any of these, you have to be very careful with them. You should not be driving super heavy tanks and heavy tanks into towns and yellow forests, because that's where infantry with strong AT weaponry, such as Panzerschrecks, bazookas, even a Panzerfaust or an AT grenade, can get in and kill your 130-point tank with a 25-point infantry unit. And this is how you create incredibly negative trades that can very quickly cause you to lose a game. So heavy tanks like this, and truthfully, even your medium tanks and stuff, really shouldn't be driving through a town without support. Okay, unless you're 100% sure the opponent has no AT in that town, you have a lot of infantry pushing forward to support that tank and spot for it, you should not be just driving tanks into towns and into yellow forests. They're going to die. They're just not going to have a good time. They're going to lose out to infantry every single time, and that's how the game is designed. Okay, so just be careful when you're using heavier armor. It's more designed to be in those open areas or to hold roads or to hold open areas, keep infantry in the forest so they can't push out, these sort of things. It's not designed to go barreling into yellow forests and into towns and stuff expecting great results because you called in a 130-point Tiger. That's just because it's 130 points doesn't mean it's like God of the battlefield, never dies to anything. It dies a lot. Okay, so you have to be careful. A lot of times players come into this game and they're like, oh, Tigers are amazing, or Panthers are great, or ooh, IS-2s are so cool, King Tiger, whatever. It's 100 whatever points. It's so much better. It should never die. No, it's very killable, especially to infantry. So it's really important that you use your armor wisely to make supported pushes and to make well-structured defenses using them, so that then you can push out using a nice combined arms to win those battles and use your tanks effectively. So these are some things to know about tanks. Important stats, remember, penetration, frontal armor, and range. Those are the three you need to know right off the top of your head. Those are the ones you got to know right away. One little side note I did forget to mention. Most weapons in this game can penetrate above the value stated on the card. So this Tiger says at point blank range, I can penetrate 165 millimeters of armor. I can tell you right now, in random situations, this tank will penetrate 170 or 180 millimeters of armor. Now, if the gap is massive, so this is 125 millimeters of armor, if a 75 millimeter penetration gun shoots at this, it will not penetrate. Okay, it's too big of a gap. The gun will have no opportunity, no chance of actually penning this tank. But closer values within 10 to 20 millimeters of penetration, those guns can oftentimes get random lucky penetrations on tanks that they should have no business penetrating. So just keep that in mind. No tank is truly indestructible. No tank can truly not be penetrated. It's just one of those things. It's like a little fail-safe built into the game that even low penetration units can sometimes get lucky. And remember, if your tank's facing to the side, your armor goes from 125 millimeters to 85 millimeters here. That's a big drop and allows for a lot more penetration chance. If you guys enjoyed this content, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more Steel Division 2 content, from tutorials to gameplay to everything in between. Check out that Patreon down below and have a fantastic day.